Welcome to Sun Moon Self. This video is about the astrology of Austrian pop star Falco. While his name may not immediately ring a bell for everybody, Falco had remarkable and to this day unsurpassed success as the first and only artist to ever have a #1 hit in the USA with a German language song. This song is the iconic Rock Me Amadeus. Falco's personality was complex, his life extreme, and his premature death very tragic. I'm giving an overview of his birth chart as interpreted through classical Western astrology, and I'm also using the Arabic parts to add an even deeper level of meaning. This ancient technique is not very much used today by modern astrologers, and I explain exactly what it is in a video that you can find in the pinned comment. Even though Falco isn't as famous as, let's say, Madonna or Michael Jackson, his popularity has been growing steadily since his death in 1998. His active musical career spanned from the 1970s as an acclaimed bassist in Austrian underground bands, well into the 80s and 90s as a solo artist with 7 studio albums under his belt and various successful singles. His reputation was that of a somewhat tongue-in-cheek, pompous eccentric, although some people had a pretty allergic reaction to his persona, and also a party animal and a womanizer. But beneath all that was a highly intelligent, vulnerable, and sensitive man who was betrayed by the woman he loved, thinking he had a daughter who wasn't his biological child. He was a complete workaholic when he wanted to be, and always a bit of a loner despite seeming quite extroverted. He was often described as a walking dichotomy, the extroverted and quite funny personality on stage and at parties and social gatherings, and then the shy and very considerate and unassuming person that he was in his private life. Falco was born as Johann Hans Hölzel in 1957 to working-class parents who had a difficult marriage, which resulted in his father leaving the family when Hans was still a kid. His mother raised him, and according to many of his friends, he totally adored her. He had a job for a while, but he wanted to be a pop star. That was all he ever dreamed of. And his estranged father had zero appreciation for that whatsoever. He thought it was all nonsense and a huge waste of time, and he didn't even change his mind when his son proved that he could actually truly make a living as a professional musician. Before becoming Falco, Hans began immersing himself in the Viennese club and anarchist political scene in the late 1970s, where he made the acquaintance of people from various walks of artistic life, such as poets, authors, musicians, painters, and performance artists. Unfortunately, he also got acquainted with a lifestyle surrounded by parties and recreational substances, and according to his own admission, he tried absolutely everything under the sun, but it was alcohol that would ultimately remain his greatest lifelong weakness. A highly competent bass player with a very precise and melodic funk feel, he started playing in bands of a notably theatrical avant-garde style, where he'd soon develop his stage persona as a strikingly elegant, slick, and self-assured poser. Falco's appearance and style of delivery made him stand out among his peers who mostly looked like hippies. Falco already had his distinct style. Clever poetry delivered in his typical snotty Viennese dialect with some English thrown in, with a heavy influence from old-school funk and hip-hop, which Falco always credited as major inspirations, along with charismatic performers such as David Bowie and Freddie Mercury. It can be argued that he was one of the first white rappers, but he was most certainly the first German-speaking one, which was completely unheard of at the time. Those who saw him perform in the early days were surprised and somewhat taken aback by how seriously he took his stage persona, how he acted like he was in front of a huge stadium crowd, when in reality it was just 30-odd people in some underground club in Vienna. His career started taking off in the early 80s with the hit Der Kommissar in 1982 and experienced its biggest peak in 1986 when Rock Me Amadeus hit the stratosphere. Several of Falco's subsequent releases performed pretty well on international charts, while others went under the radar and were only more or less successful in Germany and Austria. One song, however, managed to cause a huge controversy, which was Jeannie, telling the story of a young girl going missing from the perspective of her alleged murderer. Falco knew the value of a good scandal and deliberately left people guessing as to the song's real meaning. The press, always eager to criticize and mock him, was foaming at the mouth. Feminist organizations were outraged, and several conservative radio stations refused to play the song that, of course, went to #1, as people were buying it like crazy. Falco seemed to enjoy the controversy to a point, having deliberately created his stage persona to come across as unashamedly cocky and provocative, albeit quite humorous and self-mocking. But those qualities were consistently ignored by journalists, or they just went over their heads maybe, and they were extremely irritated by his demeanor, and it really seems that Falco enjoyed irritating the hell out of them. But after making the mistake as a young artist to open up too much about himself, he came to detest intrusive media attention where his private life was concerned. His later career was slower, in part because of a grueling concert schedule that had started taking its toll, but also because he was torn between his image and the real man, and he couldn't recognize himself in the mirror anymore, as he himself said once, and this is why he missed out on very important strategic performances in the USA. He simply didn't want to do it, and he was always extremely stubborn. If he didn't want to do something, there was absolutely no way he would. For example, he didn't want to record a duet with Madonna, who was a big fan after Amadeus came out in the USA, which would have certainly increased his popularity big time. But he simply didn't care for Madonna, so that was it. He allegedly called her a colorful word that I cannot repeat on YouTube, and he almost didn't even record the smash hit at all because he didn't think the song was that great, and allegedly he held a monologue in the studio before laying down the vocals, saying he was only recording it to fulfill his contractual duties and under utmost protest. This is what his birth chart also has told me, that he was very stubborn, but also extremely sensitive. And he has Moon in Scorpio, which might make him a little bit dramatic at times. Foregoing the fleeting opportunity to boost his career in America and opting for a period of self-reflection in order to come off the music industry circus for a while was his choice, and this is why his comeback at the end of the 80s didn't generate the same amount of international success. He went to live in the Dominican Republic in the 90s as an attempt to wind down and gain new musical inspiration, and to finish his last album, Out of the Dark, which was released shortly after his death. The major success of the single by the same title was the comeback that he had worked so hard for but never got to see, unfortunately. Falco's charisma, sharp intellect, and hilariously funny personality, much beloved by his fans and those who knew him privately, had a dark side that expressed itself through self-destructive excess. He seemed driven and obsessed, pushing himself beyond his physical and emotional limits, abusing many drugs but mainly alcohol, a problem that he would never be able to overcome, even though he was fully functional for the most part. It seems that he honestly didn't care what others thought of him, and he appeared to be totally unafraid of alienating people. But he was fully aware that his reputation in the music industry was difficult at best. His deliberately arrogant demeanor and Viennese sarcasm, however, was strictly reserved for nosy and disrespectful journalists or critics, and never his fans. He always treated the fans with congenial affection and respect. He was a lot of things to a lot of people, depending on who you ask. He was an arrogant a-hole or a wonderful, warm, super loyal friend. The short-lived marriage to the woman who betrayed his trust in a way that he could never forget was followed by more or less committed relationships, but despite finding out that he wasn't the father of his so-called daughter, he never abandoned her, and she later claimed that she would always see him as her father and spoke very lovingly about him. Hans Hölzel, aka Falco, died on February 6, 1998, in a tragic car accident in the Dominican Republic, just 2 weeks short of his 41st birthday. He was allegedly drunk and high when a bus that went over the speed limit hit his truck and killed him in an instant. Sadly, a friend was just on his way to pick him up when it happened. I have examined the astrology of his death, and I have to say that the preconditions were extremely bad. I'm not a fatalist, and I don't think that astrology should be seen as fate written in stone, unchangeable. Not at all. We have free will, and astrology is in no way interfering with that. I see it more like weather conditions. When you walk on ice, for example, you are much more likely to slip and break something if you're unsteady or just careless and don't watch where you're going. Meaning, when the astrology is difficult, and sometimes it can be quite awful, a self destructive or reckless lifestyle will absolutely exacerbate the potential for disaster. And some people's personalities, unfortunately, are more prone to this than others, and Falco's certainly was. The Cancer ascendant shows me a very emotional, stubborn, family oriented person who seeks safety and closeness in relationships and has a very caring and warm attitude towards people. With this ascendant, he would have rather withdrawn when he felt attacked, maybe not in public, where he was extremely quick with clever retorts and deliberately played with provocation, but deep down he was easily hurt and he would try to make a joke or a flippant remark to deflect from things that actually were quite painful for him. Cancer is typically very connected with the mother and the homeland and community, and in Falco's case, that's very true because he did have a very close relationship with his mother and could never turn his back on his hometown Vienna for too long. Even when he lived abroad, he was always still drawn back to his roots. Cancer is ruled by the moon, which represents the emotions and the role of the mother in a person's life. And the moon is in the very complex and intense sign Scorpio. His own emotional landscape can be described as such, and while I don't know all the details in his relationship with his mother, his chart definitely tells me that there may have been complications and certain things that were maybe left unsaid or that he didn't even want to admit to himself. Maybe there was a feeling of having to prove himself to her, or never quite being good enough, or being responsible for her emotional well-being, probably also financial well-being. The square between the moon in hyper-emotional Scorpio in the fifth house and Mercury, symbolizing the mind and communication, in hyper-rational and also extremely socially oriented Aquarius in the eighth house, tells me that there may have been deep issues, possibly also connected to his self-esteem, even his masculinity in a way, or a sense of responsibility. Apparently, his mother was never happy with any of his girlfriends, and she would always make it known that they weren't good enough for him, or something along those lines. Mars is the planet connected to confidence, ambition, masculinity in an archetypal sense, and also courage, and is in detriment in Taurus, meaning it can't express its nature that well, which can result in a degree of insecurity, but certainly hard-headedness in the fixed earth sign Taurus. And the square to Uranus in Leo tells me that he wasn't too well equipped when it came to tolerating frustrations. And he did have a temper, but it probably would have taken a lot to get him going. And when that was the case, I assume it would be best to get way out of the way. Frustrations would have nagged him for a long time, which is also a typical Scorpio moon attitude. And given the Grand Cross in fixed signs, he was very much set in his ways, strongly opinionated, and he might have found it hard to develop flexibility when it comes to emotions and also personal ideals and values. But on the positive side, such a formation signifies a really strong and steadfast character with a great deal of persistence. The moon opposite Mars also tells me that he might have had issues with women in general, maybe a bit of a macho attitude to mask insecurity, although I do not see an aggressive man. The moon is in fallen Scorpio and therefore not ideally placed. He may have felt an attraction to charismatic and sexy women with a certain dark mystique about them, also probably independence, but in the worst case, deviousness. His seventh house cusp is Saturn-ruled Capricorn, which is very cool and restricted, and Saturn is in free-spirited Sagittarius in the sixth house. What this tells me is that he was probably looking for stability, and partner hopping wasn't truly his goal, but he needed a degree of adventure, although very much wanting a family of his own, so a bit of an emotional conflict there. The Chiron moon square hints at an emotional wound, possibly from the mother, and the opposition between Uranus in Leo and Venus conjunct Mercury and Chiron in Aquarius is also something that speaks of a person who feels different, not fitting in, having a strong mind of his own, and maybe a person who isn't that easy to get along with, and certainly not easy to control. And in fact, Falco had absolutely zero respect for authority. Unquestionably a highly individualistic person, but on the other hand, this placement shows great charisma and magnetism. His second house cusp being Leo shows me that he aspired to a markedly affluent lifestyle, which he did. He said himself he likes luxury. The opposition between Mars and Neptune could have given him a somewhat self centered nature when it came to his own emotions, maybe deriving from an insecurity around women. What I find interesting is the exact square between Mercury and the part of spirit, which shows one's spiritual and mental state, the soul, purpose, motivation, thoughts, and intentions, and also hidden things and one's temper, and hints at what type of work one is supposed to be doing. In the fifth house and Scorpio, which is maybe the most emotionally intense and misunderstood sign, it's clear that he was creatively fueled by feelings and experiences that cut deep. Definitely a soul searcher, not afraid of dark themes, immensely creative, and also using language in a rational, systematic way that was connected to his own psyche as well as the collective. Definitely an individualist, but also somebody with a great deal of social consciousness and a sense of responsibility, which Mercury in Aquarius also represents. The fifth house is really important in the life of a professional creative person because it not only shows the creative hobbies but also the profession itself. The part of spirit illuminates the purpose or dharma that can, though not necessarily, coincide with one's work. And in Falco's case, it goes hand in hand, and it's hard to imagine for him to not have had a job that is in some way creative, which is additionally emphasized by his Sun and MC in Pisces, which is the sign of the mystic, poet, and artist, the one who peers behind the veil. The North Node, another pointer at one's dharmic path in life, is also in the fifth house, supporting the Pisces placements through a trine. So that is a strong indicator for someone having a natural affinity for art as a life path. The square between the part of spirit and Mercury in the eighth house confirms what I mentioned earlier about psychological eighth house issues playing into his emotional and creative expression. The square is a stressful aspect which adds a dimension of restlessness and constantly questioning oneself. With the Sun in Pisces, the theme of emotionality and sensitivity is further strengthened, in particular because the Sun and MC and the Ascendant are making mutually supportive trines. So he does have a strong emphasis on water signs as well as the fixed Grand Cross in fire. And this can manifest as a constant inner conflict of fire and water, so to speak, ambitions and emotions. The prominence of water can mean a great capacity for empathizing with others. For an artist, it can also be becoming the other, as in understanding the audience's needs, tapping into greater collective themes. And we can see what his friends and former lovers have described in terms of his genuine warmth towards people, which he really had. But the other possibility is that someone is too focused on their own emotions and therefore can't always see others. This won't make anybody a bad person, of course, but it does highlight the Mars opposite Neptune theme of sometimes maybe feeling a little bit like a victim or being too much in one's own emotional world. But he did tend to keep it all inside because Mercury, the communicator, is in the eighth house. So the communication is literally in the house of secrets, death, and sorrow, and his mind is in the Saturnian air sign Aquarius, which would have functioned in a highly rational way, excellent with words and intellectual concepts, really sharp, and rationalizing emotions despite suffering. The sun is also the archetype of the father, but so is Saturn, albeit showing a different side, which is the structure and discipline, authority, and things like that experienced from the father, plus one's own ability to control emotions. Sagittarius is a very freedom loving sign, also highly spiritual, and this could translate to a father figure who wasn't reliable and who could have curbed his son's freedom loving explorations, especially when it comes to music, of course. Neither Pisces, mutable water, nor Sagittarius, mutable fire, stands for a great deal of stability and dependability. And making a square to one another, the Sun and Saturn clearly hint at a father who wasn't there and or didn't provide much stability, who would have rather followed his own ideals. Saturn in Sagittarius also tells me that Falco had a tendency to be very hard on himself. It does give him a great sense of justice, but also a lot of restraint when it comes to grabbing opportunities. And combined with his overall stubbornness, it shows how he might not always have been so eager to jump into something new, since Saturn quite literally limits the joyful expansion sought by Sagittarius. However, Jupiter, the ruler of Sagittarius, is in Libra, and he did find great joy in music and art and refined beauty. Saturn in Sagittarius can also represent not allowing yourself to be totally at ease, never allowing for too much optimism into your life, always being cautious and assuming that there must be a low after the high, so it's better to never fully let your guard down. But he clearly did have some self-control issues with the addiction problem. He said about himself, quote, "My reputation in the industry ranges from very, very difficult to absolute definite ASS whole, and it is my duty to defend this reputation with all my might because I am a non-conformist in a conformist business." End quote. And this represents him very well, at least where his public persona is concerned. Looking at his birth chart, I can see why he was both beloved and very misunderstood. Despite some people calling him a narcissist, I don't see a narcissistic person here. I see someone who was quite giving, loyal, super creative, and despite inner conflicts, always aimed at being honest with himself. But I also see a person who would have been calculating when he wanted to be, who could definitely be jealous, and who felt a great need to be useful to others while at the same time also quite absorbed by his own emotions. I'm examining the most important transits and progressions on the day of Falco's death to see what the circumstances looked like. Simply put, transits are like the general outside weather, while progressions show an inner evolution. By an almost prophetic coincidence, Falco said in the 80s that he wanted to die like James Dean, quote, "at an intersection in a Porsche, and that's that." End quote. He didn't drive a Porsche, but it is a chilling parallel nonetheless. The progressed part of fortune is exactly conjunct Pluto retrograde in Leo. Pluto is the planet of transformation and personal power, but also the planet of death. And the part of fortune is one's physical incarnation, so that's pretty straightforward, although it doesn't have to mean physical death. But it is an indicator for a very deep transformative period with significant changes in one's life. It's in the first house of the progress chart, so immediately connected with the physical body. The progressed ascendant in Leo shows a desire to take the lead and to step into the limelight, quite literally in his case, and the Pluto fortune conjunction can entail a massive growth of personal power or coming into one's own, while the trine to progressed Mercury plus the moon in dominant fiery Aries shows a very strong will and ambition. In short, he was at a point in his life where he was absolutely driven towards success, but there was also resistance. Transiting Saturn conjunct the progressed Sun in Aries and exactly trine Saturn in Sagittarius makes a grand trine in fire with his progressed ascendant in Leo, and this emphasizes the aforementioned ambition and brings an element of impulsivity into the mix, but Saturn is the big reality check, the limitation, and it's like showing someone that they can't keep burning themselves up from both ends, or that reckless decisions will have to face consequences and will be reined in by Saturn, which is also the planet of karma. It also forces somebody to bring structure and discipline into one's aspirations, and that they may not be able to go forward immediately, or quite directly, a limitation or end to one's physical vitality, either through illness, death, or whatever constraining circumstance. The transiting Sun is conjunct the progress DC and Chiron, making an almost exact square to transiting Chiron, the latter almost exactly conjunct the North Node, and this hints at a vulnerability connected to relationships, sexuality, deep emotions, possibly something that wasn't going well at home or with the woman, a woman breaking up with him, or him being more interested in the woman than she was in him, which apparently seems to have been the case because a woman that he had a big crush on suddenly broke up with him, and he did not take this lightly. Progressed Mars in Gemini in the 10th house is exactly square transiting Mars in Pisces in the 8th house, and this shows me possible fear concerning his career or public image, frustration, self-doubt, or maybe just bad press and gossip. The exact trine between progressed Mars in Gemini and transiting Uranus in the 6th house could also certainly add a destabilizing and nervous disruption within his daily routine and health, the potential for which would have been present for quite some time because Uranus is a slow moving planet. So this would have been a longer period of a general weakness with his health and addictive tendencies. Uranus is the unpredictable chaos bringer and makes a sextile with transiting Pluto. This also is difficult because, on the one hand, it could bring massive creativity, but also serious obsession and things like insomnia, various nervous disorders, irregular eating habits, heightened nervous sensitivity, also drug stuff. So, pretty bad for somebody battling addiction. The biggest indicator of a vulnerable and somewhat unstable position is the progressed part of Nemesis. This is the part of death, and it is exactly conjunct the progressed MC, which stands for the public life, career, and reputation. This part is ruled by Saturn, death, endings, limitations, reality checks, karma. So the MC Nemesis conjunction can be read quite literally as death or an end being near, or at the very least seriously constraining and maybe isolating circumstances pertaining to his career and public image, something like loneliness, maybe depression, an end to a previous career path. In this case, it could have been all of those things. By all accounts, he was kind of in a depressive state, at least in part, but he was also very, very eager to complete his new album, and he planned more sessions with musicians, so he did not seem despondent. And the opposition of the progress Nemesis conjunction with progress Neptune is exactly on the IC. This is a theme of deception, illusion, something concerning the family maybe, or his home life, domestic life, and also a great propensity for escapism and addiction. His progress part of spirit is conjunct Uranus retrograde in the progress 12th house and makes an exact square to Neptune, resulting in a T-square with the MC Nemesis conjunction. And this is really, really difficult and emphasizes the theme of profound loneliness and introspection, also a level of pain that he might have wanted to escape from. When looking at these things, the first thing that came to mind was Dark Night of the Soul. It seems to me that he didn't quite know what he wanted exactly, but he was immensely driven by a huge desire to change something and, of course, to achieve commercial success again. When we also take transiting Neptune into consideration, remember transits are momentary snapshots of the planets affecting everyone, while progressed planets show the individual's own inner evolution. We can see transiting Neptune completing an exact fixed grand cross, and this adds an element of persistent habits, possibly also delusion, again escapism, also certainly artistic inspiration, but a degree of deception, murkiness, and in the 6th house, yet again the theme of addiction, vulnerable health, especially in connection with substance abuse, autoimmune issues, or nervous disorders of various kinds. Also, Neptune is borderless, boundless, and this is another reflection of the theme of not knowing when to stop, not understanding one's own boundaries, and being excessive. I think there are some very clear hints that Falco, at the time of his death, was at a crucial point in his life, deeply driven, but in a state of mind that wasn't quite clear as to what to do next. In other words, a crisis. It might have been an artistic turning point or a confrontation with inner demons. He probably would have needed more time, simple as that, to process things and hopefully resolve some of them. But he did put himself under tremendous pressure while at the same time stalling his own progress. There has been much speculation about him wanting to possibly end his own life, but I do not see that. Neither do his close friends, who all vehemently deny any such tendencies. They said that he loved life way too much, and even if he had chosen to go, he never ever would have done so in a way that endangered others, such as deliberately colliding with a bus full of people. The most likely scenario is that he either didn't see the bus coming in his adult state or he couldn't react quickly enough because of it. His song Out of the Dark, interestingly reflecting the dark night of the soul theme, was a huge hit following his death, and many people interpreted the lyrics to mean that he wanted to die, especially one line that goes, Muss ich denn sterben, zu leben? Must I die in order to live? And this one sparked much controversy. But remember who Falco is, an intelligent poet and someone who had zero qualms about making people wonder what he meant. And we also need to remember that song lyrics are more often than not deliberately dramatic, not to mention metaphorical. The astrology confirms that he was indeed self-destructive to a degree, somewhat disoriented and quite vulnerable to addictions at the time of his death, but also extremely motivated and eager to make his mark in the music world again. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel and leave a comment, and visit my website for more information about what I do as a professional astrologer and how you can book a personalized reading with me if you so wish. Until next time!